Good morning, everyone. My name is Harshit Sehgal, and I'm with the Ananta Center. Thank you very much for joining us today for a very special session on how the Chinese negotiate with India. China is a focus country for us at the center, and we continue our engagement with China through our Track 2 dialogue, roundtables, and public sessions. Today, we are delighted to have with us two esteemed panelists, Mr. Vijay Gokhale and Mr. Syed Akbaruddin, to share their insights on this complex relationship. A very warm welcome to both of you. Mr. Gokhale is a distinguished professor at Symbiosis Pune, Symbiosis International Pune. Thank you very much for being with us today. We're delighted to have you speak at the session. I would also like to welcome Mr. Syed Akbaruddin. Mr. Akbaruddin is the Dean of the Kautilya School of Public Policy in Hyderabad. He served as the permanent representative of India to the United Nations and was a former spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs. Prior to his assignment at the UN, Mr. Akbaruddin played a key role as the chief coordinator in the organization of the India-Africa Forum Summit. He also served as an international civil servant at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, and as the head of the External Relations and Policy Coordination Unit. Mr. Akbaruddin, I'm so glad you're chairing this important session today. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I'm really looking forward to a very interesting discussion today. Mr. Akbaruddin, may I request you to kindly chair the session? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harshit. And thank you all for joining what promises to be a very interesting session on how China negotiates with India. It's a topic that is, of course, of interest to those who follow Indian foreign policy, but I'm sure the interest on this is not restricted to those who are only interested in diplomacy. In many ways, the rise of China is amongst the most significant changes we have witnessed in our lifetimes in terms of global issues. Since the other significant change we have witnessed is the increased connectivity of the world. This has added to the impact of China on the rest of the world. Thus, what China does and how it engages with us as Indians has considerable significance on not only foreign policy issues, but on a host of other subjects. Given the Chinese notion of military-civil fusion, issues such as defense, science and technology, trade, investment, health, environment, etc., all are now fair game. In short, the canvas is vast, and so are the opportunities from a better understanding of how China thinks and negotiates with India. We had with us today Mr. Vijay Gokhale. He is someone whose expertise on the subject can be perhaps conveyed in many ways. Many of you know him as a diplomat whose distinguished diplomatic career culminated with his tenure as India's Foreign Secretary. By my count, Mr. Gokhale has spent about 20 of the last 40 years of his life primarily focused on issues relating to China. He has worked on China-related matters in Beijing, maybe 3 times in Beijing by my count, Hong Kong, Taipei, New Delhi, and now in Pune. Besides, I'm sure, he has also pursued his interest in China elsewhere, including in Kuala Lumpur and Hanoi, Berlin, and certainly in New York when I had the honor of working with him in the rest of the 20 years where he was not primarily focused on China. So many consider Vijay, as he is well known to many of us, as one of the most knowledgeable Indians about issues relating to China. In the space of just this year, he's published 2 books, Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest. And I recollect that this was a passion for him going back to the early 90s when he first came back from China. More recently, he's also published another book, The Long Game, How China Negotiates with India. And going by the prolific pace he is used to in his avatar now as an academic, and a distinguished professor of the Symbiosis International, Pune, I would think he may well be working on another book. So who better than Vijay Gokhale to outline for us how China negotiates with India? The format that we will follow is that Mr. Gokhale will make an initial presentation on how China negotiates with India, drawing upon examples that he wants to highlight based on his own experiences. Then I will engage him on what he has said and also on issues relating to the topic that he may not have said but are germane. Following that, we will have a question and answer session drawn from the large and growing number of participants that I see now are online. So my request to all of you who have joined us for this session is, please send in your questions throughout the session. Don't wait until the end. We will be taking up your questions during the Q&A session. If you are watching this session on Zoom, use the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen. And if you are on Facebook, please write your questions in the comment section. With that introduction, now I hand you over to Mr. Vijay Gokhale to make his introductory remarks. Over to you, Vijay.
Akbar, thank you for your very kind words. And I want to thank Ananta for inviting me for this event. I wrote the book, The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India, not from the objective of writing another book on India-China relations. There are excellent books already available. This particular book was to look at the ways and means that China adopts in negotiating with us. And I had three basic objectives when I wrote the book. The first was, of course, to write from the Indian perspective, because almost all the books on negotiating with China are written by Americans or by the West. And that doesn't necessarily apply ipso facto to us. Secondly, I wanted to see if we could identify patterns of Chinese behavior. And lastly, also to see whether over a period of time, any lessons had been learned by us. And so I adopted the case study method, and I selected 6 case studies spanning the entire period of our relationship from 1949 to 2019. I will divide this into 2 basic periods. The first 2 chapters really dealt with the early part of our relationship in the 1950s, and the subsequent 4 case studies dealt with events post-1995. With regard to the first 2 chapters, the chapters dealing with how we recognized the People's Republic of China and then how we reached an agreement with them on the issue of Tibet and trade, I have 2 basic observations that I want to present to those who are listening in. I believe that during this period, there was a fundamental mismatch in 2 ways between the 2 countries, which impacted upon the negotiation. The first was a mismatch in approach, the approach that the 2 countries took with regard to the other. And the second was a mismatch of perception. So very, very briefly, let me talk about this. The mismatch in approach, to my mind, arose from our individual experiences in seeking freedom from colonialism or from semi-colonial rule. For India, the Indian National Congress, which was the political movement, predicated itself on 2 important strategies or principles. The first was ahimsa. In other words, we abjured the use of force as an instrument of policy in seeking independence. The party didn't have a military wing. It criticized acts of terror by others. So ahimsa was a very critical platform for our freedom struggle. The second, of course, was negotiation. In other words, the leaders of India's independence movement believed that the colonial power would be made to exit India through a negotiation, and that the subsequent arrangement would be a viable, sustainable outcome. So these 2, the use of the principle of non-violence and the use of negotiation, were what shaped our whole approach to independence, and I believe it impacted on subsequent foreign policy. The Chinese approach was rather different. As early as 1927, we have evidence of Mao Zedong writing to the Central Committee, talking about organizing the peasants into a violent force for change. And very soon after that, in 1929, the party passed a resolution establishing the people, what was called the Red Army at that time, now the People's Liberation Army, as the military wing of the party. In other words, force was a primary element to secure objectives in their case. And secondly, negotiation was not a way of securing objectives, but of buying time. So, for instance, the number of negotiations that the Communist Party had with the KMT or the Kuomintang to try and form united front governments were not with the intention of having positive outcomes, but essentially delaying the confrontation between them until the Chinese were strong enough to do so. So I believe this mismatch in approach resulted in our not fully appreciating what the new Chinese leadership was like when it came to negotiation. The second, of course, was a mismatch of perception. And this again sprang out of our experiences during the anti-colonial movement. In our case, as soon as we became independent, there was a separation of party and state. The Indian National Congress was a political party, but not the only political party. And the interests of the Indian state differed from the interests of the Congress party. In the case of China, the state and the party fused into a single indistinguishable whole. And therefore, the party's survival became the state's foreign policy. In the case of India, the survival of the Congress party did not become the foreign policy of the state. In the case of China, it did. And again, this resulted in a fundamental mismatch in perception. We, for instance, believed that we shared a historical experience with the Chinese, that we had similar colonial experiences or experiences during colonialism, that we both believed that we were Asian civilizations and that together we could shape the post-World War II order. This was not the perception of the Chinese Communist Party. They saw India essentially as a subordinate civilization. They considered India very much to be in the British or the imperialist camp. And they believed that, in fact, they described Prime Minister Nehru as a lackey of the British. And therefore, I believe this misperception in approach, as well as in perception, led to a misreading of China's intentions. Firstly, therefore, we surrendered important cards that we had to play without really playing them. For instance, recognizing China without demanding anything in return, giving up the whole issue of whether we should recognize Taiwan as an independent country or as a second China, making concessions on Tibet. All of these were done without any serious asks on our part. Secondly, we were unable to read the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore we were unable to leverage our relations with the United States and the Soviet Union, both of whom were interested in pursuing relations with us in the 1950s. And my sense is that all of this, of course, led to the debacle of 1962. Now, the subsequent 4 chapters, of course, dealt with a very different period of our relationship, which was post-1995. And I believe by then we had gained, well, firstly, we had gained experience. We had dealt with the Chinese for 40 years. We had built expertise. There was a fairly solid group of people in the External Affairs Ministry as well as in other agencies of the government of India who had lived, worked, and studied China. We had gained in confidence. Post-Cold War, the economy had taken off, and we had built capacities, not only economic, but the nuclear tests also gave us a certain strategic capacity. So we started dealing with China post-1995 or certainly post-1998 in a very different way. We were less trusting of the Chinese. We were able to distinguish words from their deeds. We were ready to play the waiting game. In other words, we were not anxious to reach a settlement. And this was evident. This is evident in my chapters on Sikkim and on the Masood Azhar listing. And of course, Mr. Akbaruddin played the pivotal role in that latter instance. And we were also able to leverage others like the United States or Russia. And that was again evident both in the way we managed to finesse the whole issue of the nuclear tests, as well as on the 1-2-3 deal. And therefore, my sense after working on the book was that we were able to hold our own against the Chinese despite the widening capacity gap. The economic capacities of China were outstripping us quickly. The military capacity was outstripping us quickly, but we were able to hold our own. The final chapter of the book, of course, which many people think is the most interesting part of the book, is the lessons of how, I really discussed the ways and means of negotiating with China and what the Chinese do in a negotiation. So I thought I'd very briefly also highlight that a bit here. First, I do emphasize that the pre-negotiation stage is critical from China's perspective, because China uses this time to set up the game through three means: through agenda setting, through the determination of the venue, and through the public messaging that it gives. In other words, it is able to build an invisible frame, which perhaps we are not able to see, but basically on which it pegs the subsequent negotiation. And if we don't pay attention to these aspects, particularly the agenda setting, we tend to land up discussing on the lines of their agenda. So the pre-negotiation stage, in my opinion, with Chinese, whether it is in diplomacy, in business, in education, or in any other field, is an extremely critical part of the negotiation process. The second point I have highlighted is our need to understand the Chinese negotiator. And I'm highlighting this particularly because the international community is extremely excited these days over the whole wolf warrior diplomacy, about China's aggressive behavior, its use of crude language, and other irritable or disagreeable traits. My main thesis, however, in the book is that this is simply grand theater, and we should take it for what it is, grand theater. Words and gestures are not intended to convey deep emotions. When they are angry, they are not conveying anger. When they are happy, they are not conveying joy. What they are conveying are messages. And therefore, any sort of behavioral trait is a put-on, in my opinion. And I think we need to recognize that. Secondly, I think we all are particularly susceptible, and by all I don't just mean Indians, I mean globally, to what we see as professions of Chinese friendship. They want to be friends with us. But in fact, my own experience is that you can't make friends with a Chinese diplomat. He is not there, he or she is not there to make friends. They are there to build relationships for the negotiating purpose and to use those relationships to their advantage. Lastly, of course, the one important distinction between us, the Indian diplomats, and them, the Chinese diplomats, is that they are creatures of the party. Not like us, we are creatures of the state, of the constitution. And therefore, we are not ideologically driven, whereas for them, the party's ideology predominates the state's interests. And if there is a clash, rare, but it happens, they are obliged to serve the party. So I thought that it was important to highlight that when you're negotiating with the Chinese, it's not like negotiating with a representative of some other democratic state. Thirdly, I highlighted the process of negotiations, their capacity to immediately establish a hierarchy in which they are higher and we are lower, their capacity to make long statements which are essentially for the record. They don't intend informal meetings to actually negotiate. The idea is to state your maximalist position and to gauge the adversary or rivals or the opposite party's bottom line. That is really the objective. Then, of course, the whole issue of let's talk principles. Now, this, of course, is quite an irritating subject for many of us. But, of course, in those principles, they build in the essential framework for the final settlement. And eventually, we find ourselves caught up in these principles down the road of negotiation if we have not paid initial attention to them. Now, in addition, there are what I call the two deadly sins. The first is when the Chinese go on saying no. One of their favorite phrases is "不可以" in Chinese, which is not possible. Nothing is possible. When whatever the opposite side suggests, the response is "不可以" or not possible. And eventually they wear you down to the point at which you make alternative proposals. They've given nothing away. They've managed to whittle you away from your original position and forced you to make an alternative proposition. We have to guard against that. If they don't budge an inch, we don't budge an inch. The second is taking silence as acquiescence or approval. And to my mind, this is the deadliest sin we can commit with the Chinese. Silence is resorted to by the Chinese only when they want to obfuscate or when they deny your position. It is certainly not acquiescence, and it is never acceptance. And in the early years, we made several mistakes tragically, where we assumed Chinese silence to be acquiescence of our ideas or proposals and even acceptance of them. The last point I want to make about this chapter is this whole issue of I am a victim and please give me face. Now, these are two very popular notions the Chinese play upon. The Chinese pretend as if they were the only victims of colonialism, that they were the only people wronged by the colonial powers. And then there is this whole issue of giving them face. There's no question of them giving face to anybody else. But what these two plays do, these two particular moves do, is that firstly, by playing the victim, China wins sympathy, empathy. You tend to agree with the Chinese position. And by giving them face, they come out of any negotiation, whether they come out winners, losers, or equals, as a winner, because you're giving them the face. And therefore, what you are helping them project publicly may be very different from the position that actually emerges from a negotiation. And therefore, this is the objective of the book really, was that I hoped it would spark many more books or papers or monographs from people who have done negotiations with the Chinese, not just in the field of diplomacy, but in the field of business, in the field of education, in the field of science and technology, in whatever. Because I think that this is the most important diplomatic relationship we will have in this century. And every little bit that helps us understand how to deal with the Chinese through negotiation is going to come to the advantage and benefit of all of us who negotiate, whether we do so at the level of the government or at any other level. And that really was what I was hoping to achieve through this book. Obviously, the reader has to make her or his mind up. But from the initial feedback I've got, I think that the chapter on the lessons that we can draw from the past experiences seems to have at least started a debate, and a rather timely one at that, on how we need to negotiate with the Chinese, how we need to train our people to do so, and what sort of tools, ways and means we need to develop. So Akbar, I'll stop there. I hope I've given a sort of general idea about the book, and I'm happy to take any questions from you or anybody else in the audience.
Thank you very much, Vijay. You certainly have packed a lot in the 15-20 minutes that you've spoken. Obviously, your book is a masterpiece for all of us who are engaged with China. And as you said, more than 100 countries, I think, have their largest trade partner is China, maybe more than 110, perhaps. So obviously, China as an entity looms large, not only in India, but elsewhere. So let me start with what you China watchers always say. And that's been a consistent theme also in your thinking and in your book, that China plays the long game. Now, can you tell us what are the reasons for this long game? Is it because it's a centralized mechanism? Is it unique because it's Chinese tradition predating the current system? Because both China and India actually got independence or regained independence approximately the same time. Or is it just a status quo power that is using this long game to deny India, which is a change power in its relationship with China? And therefore, it's a useful thing. So tell us, what is this long game? And what are, I mean, you outlined the ingredients of the long game, but can you tell us what are the imperatives of this long game? Why is China playing this long game?
Yeah, thank you, Akbar. That's a question that I have always wanted to answer because that's the title of the book as well. When I say that China plays the long game, I really have three individual points. Firstly, if you notice, China rarely sets deadlines for itself. We don't know when it is going to unify with Taiwan. We don't know when it is going to settle the boundary with India, and so on. So in other words, it uses time flexibly to pin the other side on the mat, but never to allow itself to be pinned down. And therefore, the game can be over in as short a period as 1 year, or it can be stretched on to a generation or two. That's the first point. The second is it uses time as a way of deflection from its real goals, and I dare say even at times deceiving others. So for instance, there is a regular refrain on the Chinese side as to the importance of leaving the boundary question with India to be settled by future generations. Of course, they conveniently forget that while saying that, they want us to conveniently forget that while saying that, they are busy with all their activities on the line of actual control. So in other words, they sort of deflect attention by saying this problem doesn't have to be solved now, but then their deeds actually are doing something else. This is exactly the case in the South China Sea. You have a declaration of the Code of Conduct in 2002. You continue to negotiate till 2021 without results. But on the ground, there are fundamental changes in the South China Sea after the declaration of the Code of Conduct has come into being, and before a Code of Conduct itself can be enacted. So again, negotiating is for buying time and using that time to tilt the balance of power. It's a long game. Thirdly, of course, as I said, the idea is to put others under pressure of time. And over time, the Chinese have realized that while there is no hurry on their part because the same party has ruled for 70 odd years, in a democracy, it's different. Parties have a 4, 5 or 6 year time frame. Presidents and prime ministers don't have the luxury of thinking beyond their electoral mandate. And the closer you come to an election and the greater the need to show a success, the more the Chinese use time as a pressure on you. They are perfectly prepared to wait and deal with the next administration if it comes to that, as we saw with the United States towards the end of the Trump administration. So for a variety of reasons, I use time, and the long game is the issue of time, to show the Chinese negotiating strategy. Now, as to how this has come about, I think it certainly has a historical antecedent. Chinese have traditionally tended to think long term, and also, unlike other countries, Chinese dynasties have tended to appropriate the customs, traditions, rituals of the predecessor dynasties in order to gain legitimacy. And of course, one of the things they've therefore adopted are their territorial claims. So irrespective of or not whether China actually exercised control over a particular area, if the 5 previous dynasties have claimed it, then automatically the succeeding dynasty would claim that as well. That is part of the tradition. So to some extent, there is a historical aspect. To some extent, there is a very particularly communist aspect. The communists, as I said, never believed in negotiation as leading to viable long-term outcomes. They saw negotiation as a means of respite, of reprieve, of buying time. So therefore, they stretch out that time in order to get the best possible deal. And part of it, I think, is just good negotiating tactics, which many countries adopt, which is if the other side's back is to the wall because the prime minister or the president is facing an election, then you might as well use that opportunity to extract the best possible thing. So that really is sort of at least my interpretation of why I say the Chinese play the long game.
Thanks, Vijay. It gives greater clarity to what this long game is about. So if I may ask, then the takeaway from this is that we too play the long game because that's the only game in town with the Chinese. The other games are you will wear yourself out. So should we also play the long game? And is it as a system, can democracies play the long game?
I think democracies can play the long game. We've seen the United States, for instance, after 1945 playing a long game. A number of European countries, including France, do that as well. But I think for that, two or three essential ingredients are required. I think, firstly, we require a certain amount of governmental stability. Now, I distinguish between political stability, and India is a very stable entity constitutionally and politically as a democratic state. But we went through a great phase of governmental instability due to the absence of a strong government over a long period of time, experiments with coalition governments. That situation, I think, we have essentially remedied after 1998. If you look at it in the past almost quarter century, India has had only 3 prime ministers and 3 fairly successful governments that have survived their full term. So I think that has been remedied. The second is a long-term strategic thinking within the government, but also within the intellectual and academic community. My sense is that there is such a perspective within the government, but the connections between government and the outside communities are still, in my opinion, weak. We don't have a strong fix or a strong connect between the think tanks and government, between strategic business thinking and government, between the media and government, as well as between science and technology, research, innovation, that world and governance. I think all these are critical for a long-term perspective, because these days, a lot of planning is on topics of artificial intelligence or quantum computing or digital currency, subjects where the government per se may not have competence, and where you need a technical or an intellectual input which may not be readily available within the government. That connect, I think, is required. Lastly, of course, you need to have public opinion which accepts that there are certain long-term strategic goals. And that effort, I think, is underway, but still needs to be built. You need visions to be presented. I certainly believe the Indo-Pacific is one vision which Indians can relate to, because it relates to us historically as well. As somebody said, India's wealth and prosperity for several centuries didn't come from the Indo-Gangetic Plain. It came from the Malabar coast, from Gujarat, from the Coromandel coast, from Bengal, from our coastal regions, but also because the Indo-Pacific is a very clear vision outlined. So my sense is democracies can play the long game. I want to add one caveat, however. The long game does not necessarily mean that you delay a decision. It means that you utilize the time gained in order to strengthen your position in a negotiation. And we really need to introspect whether we were able to do so when we had the time to do so, because negotiation had afforded us that time. But I'll leave that point hanging there.
Right. Thank you very much. So from what I understand of what you've said, the Chinese play a long game, but they're also playing a multiplayer game, not a single game. Now, that's interesting, because some of the issues that you highlighted in your book, we seem to have done reasonably well when we play the multiplayer game also, because when we played a one-to-one game, and this was, you've given the reasons in the past, pre-90s, where we seem to have not done as well. But if you look at some of the examples where we've done reasonably well, whether it is the post-Pokhran fallout, whether it's the sanctioning of Masood Azhar, whether it's the 1-2-3 agreement. Now, in each of these cases, we seem to have played the multiplayer game quite well. So if I can ask you, do you see that a multiplayer game is a good game to play with the Chinese, because it in some way may negate some of the other advantages that they have? And if so, what's the multiplayer game that India should engage in?
So Akbar, I totally share your view on this. In fact, my own view has always been that our belief in strategic independence or in strategic autonomy does not mean that we are alone or that we should act alone. It simply means that when acting or in taking a decision, we have the wherewithal, which gives us a measure of independence to take an independent decision. And I think the error we made in the 1950s was to believe that that China considered us as equal, we considered China as an equal, and that they would look at us accordingly, and that the two of us together could negotiate. We didn't need anybody else. After the year 2000, and particularly beginning from the end of the Cold War, I think these perceptions have changed. We ourselves have recognized that there is that strategic autonomy or independence doesn't mean we don't align with other countries, provided we do so on the basis of issues or common concerns and not on the basis of ideology. But if we align on issues of common concern, we do strengthen our position, our hand in the negotiation. And I think the two examples that you mentioned, particularly the nuclear tests and the 123 nuclear deal, were classic cases where we were able to strengthen our hand in negotiating with the Chinese by actually ensuring that we were aligned with other countries. Now, I don't think that, in my sense, I think the governments since 1998 have all followed a multi-alignment strategy in their own way, according to their own views. And I think we have been fairly successful in that. And therefore, I think that if the Chinese side is unwilling to accept us as an equal, if they play the hierarchy game with us, we must leverage our relations with the other countries in order to correct the balance. It's all about balance. If in their eyes, it is an unbalanced bilateral relationship, then we simply add ballast to our side with the help of others to bring it to balance. And I think that's the approach that governments of India are taking, and I think that's the right approach.
Okay, Vijay, thanks. Now let me take up something that you may not have touched upon so far, but something which, these days, anything that you say, whether in the book or on social media, it's what you have said. So I noticed that recently in some of your forays on Twitter, you've made some points, and for those of our viewers who may not be aware, Vijay is now an active social media enthusiast. He has a Twitter account called @VGokhale59, where he regularly draws attention to issues related to China. So for China watchers, it's a must-follow account. So I was trying to look at the account, and you recently tweeted about this new Pentagon report, which dwells at great length about China and what it's preparing for. And it fits in with many of the things that you're saying, that they're preparing for a longer term issue. They say that they are preparing for 2027, 2030, etc. So looking from where you are today, can you outline what are the main themes that China is preparing for? So that, yes, we've had this experience. It's not a pleasant experience. We are trying to adjust. But what should we be prepared for based on some of the trend lines that are coming out on global issues, on regional issues, and also on our border? So could you try and amplify some of these trends, please?
Yeah. Thanks, Akbar. This, the Department of Defense, what is called the Pentagon, brings out a report every year. But this year's report, I think, is something which shows a substantial accretion in China's military power. Now, to some degree, I would attribute this to the fact that in the United States, there is a fundamental shift in thinking about China. But a number of the factual statements that the Department of Defense report, what is called the China Military Power Report or Review, makes, have a direct implication for India's national security. So let me just spell out a couple of points. There are significant developments on the nuclear front, which will have a major impact on India. First, of course, the report says that China is going to increase its nuclear warheads by 5 times in the next 10 years. In other words, from what they presume is roughly about 250 nuclear warheads today to close to 1,000 nuclear warheads by the year 2030. This obviously has direct implications for us. But what is more concerning is the mention in the report that they might be reactivating the Lop Nor test site. And the objective, they believe, the report believes, is to test low-yield tactical nuclear weapons against campaign and tactical targets. Now here, of course, India is up front and center. This is precisely where you would deploy, you would use a tactical nuclear weapon in a border conflict. So I believe that this is an important aspect. Thirdly, of course, there's the whole aspect that for the first time, the report categorically says that China has a fully operational nuclear triad. In other words, the Chin-class SSBN submarines can now be deployed for long terms in the Indian Ocean. They also have the H-6N bomber, which is capable of delivering nuclear payloads. So in other words, the nuclear threat emanates for us not just from continental China, but from the Chinese deployments in the Indian Ocean or the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's important. The second set of concerns are obviously naval. The China military power review talks of the tidal wave of sea power, and it is a tidal wave. By 2030, the report assumes that China's surface and underwater combatant ships, capital ships, will have exceeded the United States. And that does not counting their maritime militia, their underwater unmanned vehicles, and so on. But this means their capacity to deploy permanently in the Indian Ocean will be something we need to prepare for in the next 24 to 36 months. And in addition to that, of course, the report also highlights that they're looking for additional bases in the Indian Ocean. They've highlighted a number of countries, including some in our immediate vicinity. So this combination will make it much more difficult for us to exercise our authority in the Indian Ocean. And thirdly, of course, the whole issue of the hypersonic and space area. The fact that they are deploying the DF, the Tungfeng 17, which is the first operational hypersonic weapon system, is a matter of concern for us. But what struck me in the report was much more their deployment of satellites. Apparently, in the last 18 months, at least according to the report, I can't vouch for it, China has launched 80 satellites, 80. About half of which they claim support situational awareness of regional rivals. In other words, their capacity to track our forces, our developments, our geography, 40 additional satellites in just the last 1 year alone. Now, if you put all these collectively together, I think the report highlights very obvious areas of concern, both in terms of conventional forces, in terms of strategic forces, as well as in terms of the whole dimension of new warfare, autonomous capabilities, use of artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, and so on. And I think there's a lot of food for thought, because at the end of it all, the exponential increase in technological difference between India and China in the military field will obviously translate into a new approach that the Chinese will take diplomatically with us as well. And therefore, we can't simply separate this and say that we will continue to negotiate with the Chinese as we were, when in fact their capabilities are not just taking a quantum jump, but a qualitative jump as well.
Thanks, Vijay. This is rather a worrisome scenario that you've painted about developments in the nuclear front, on space, on the naval front, satellite, etc. I want to draw your attention to another recent development that I suppose we can't ignore. And I read somewhere about recent news of the so-called land borders law that the Chinese may have promulgated recently. Now, can you just sketch out for us what this means for us with a disputed boundary with China? Is this a form of structuring the negotiating table, as you say many times, working out a framework well in advance of the negotiations, and what should we be prepared for this sort of a new law? Why was there a need for this law? Because after all, this dispute and borders, China has largely settled its borders with most countries. Primarily with us, maybe one or two other issues are left hanging with others. But so do we see this as primarily directed towards us because the land border law? So can you just try and help us make sense of what this is about before I open up questions from the rest of the audience?
So Akbar, very briefly, first, this is not an India-specific law. Although boundaries have been settled with many of the other countries, concerns remain. Spillover of terrorism, fundamentalism, highly disturbed minorities, which might make common cause with people across the border and so on and so forth. So the border law is designed to tackle not simply disputed boundaries, but also those which have been finalized, but from which threat is perceived. Having said that, however, the law actually has very significant implications for us. Firstly, it reiterates that China will resolutely defend its sovereignty and land border security. Now, an iteration of that sort always complicates matters because China has claimed sovereignty over very large parts of Indian territory. The second part of it, at least seemingly authorizes the PLA and its cousin, the People's Armed Police, to use force, weapons, in defense of their borders. Now, of course, how does this impact on the agreements we have with China, where both sides have agreed on a certain protocol during the face-offs, where weapons will not be used, remains to be seen. The Chinese have, of course, made the generic statement that this doesn't impact on existing agreements, but we have known them to renege on existing agreements as well in East Ladakh. So I don't think we should take Chinese statements at face value. Thirdly, and I think this is the one of most concern, is the civil-military fusion strategy, which leads to the creation of villages. Now, the important point is these new villages are not being built on their side of the boundary where the India-China relationship is concerned. It is being built inside the disputed areas. In other words, there is a change of status quo inside the disputed areas. And these disputed areas are not areas of dispute on the boundary. These are being built in areas of dispute on the alignment of the line of actual control. Therefore, the short point I want to make is this, Akbar. I don't think we've, at least I have not seen any clear view as to why we believe the Chinese did what they did in East Ladakh in 2020. But the border law inclines me to believe, I am inclined to believe that there is a much larger strategic plan unfolding than simply a one-off effort in the Galwan Valley. I believe that there is an attempt by the Chinese side to build infrastructure and settlements inside what we claim are disputed areas of the line of actual control, which will in a year or 2 or 5 years allow the Chinese to say, there is no dispute on the line of actual control. We are here. And if you claim this was disputed, where are you? So I think that this is a particularly critical phase in India-China relations. They have created the legal framework to justify their de facto military actions, very similar to what they have done in the South China Sea. And I think red flags must go up over the border.
Thank you, Vijay, for explaining so lucidly what we need to take very seriously. Now, as is understandable, there are a host of questions. More than that we can handle right away, but let me try and summarize 3 of them into one, and it follows from the concerns that you raised. And these are from people who I'm certain you know. So they are from Ambassador Suresh Goyal, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, and also Vice Admiral Shekhar Sinha. Now, all 3 of them have similar concerns, saying that if the situation is as you outlined, that China Ambassador Vishnu Prakash says China actually seemed to be full of superhumans, crafty, well-organized people. Now, if that is the case, and they have an inherent advantage when they are negotiating with us. So what do you think would be the options for us in view of this sort of longer term thinking, this sort of build up, this sort of intransigence on the border? And if so, and if China doesn't negotiate, except dictate from a position of superior military power, Vice Admiral Sinha says, what are the options for us? So it's like 3 questions put into one, but basically the same theme, that what are our options in the face of such an adversary?
Sure. Well, Akbar, firstly, I think we are now much more confident of dealing with China, both in terms of negotiating with them and dealing with them on the ground. So I think that any notion that the Chinese are a super race, which may have been a notion earlier on, I don't think anybody who is negotiating with the Chinese or on the ground dealing with them believes that any longer. Secondly, I think that based on the experience we have gained, the expertise we have, the government's position and policy has been crafted very carefully. And I think the recent statements and positions of the government, which have made it clear that disengagement and de-escalation are a necessary precondition for the normalization of the relationship, is in a sense a way of tackling the Chinese at the negotiating level. In other words, we are again separating words and deeds. We are making it clear to the Chinese that the words which suggest the need for peace and 5 principles and so on is all right, but that the deeds on the ground are different, are giving us a different message, and that we prefer to work our own policy based on the deeds on the ground. But I think the third and important point, which eventually I guess we will all have to accept, I mean, by all I mean as a society, is that the period of peaceful coexistence is over. It will be a period of armed coexistence, at least for a decade or 2, until we are able to resolve the fundamentals of our relationship. That necessarily means a higher expenditure on defense, and it means we should not be making choices between land border defense, maritime defense, and defense of the outer space or the cyberspace, which means there will be additional expenditures incurred, which means that we have to modernize the military, both in doctrine as well as in the equipment. And I think that as a society and as a nation, we have to be supportive of these efforts, although it will involve a certain cost to all of us personally as well as a society. So I think if we can do that, there is no reason to believe that we will not be able to hold up our position vis-a-vis China in the coming 10 or 20 years, because we too are growing economically, we too are growing in influence globally, and I think that we have the building blocks for a fairly solid policy.
Thanks, Vijay. So here's another question, and this relates to the past, and the question is from Mr. Bipendra, who says, are there any leverages from the past that we did not utilize in the past that can be utilized now or in the future? And I think he means by that, is there an issue? Can we stoke Tibet again? Can we raise issues of Taiwan or recognition again? Are these any more leverages, or they are now issues that we have to move beyond and look towards other areas of leverages?
Akbar, I think the government's position on both issues is clear, and I would not like to speculate on what might be government policy in the future. I think these are sensitive matters, and I would prefer to leave them to those who are in government to deal with it, frankly speaking.
Fair enough. The other question is that you've explained in some detail how China negotiates with India. Now, is it very different from how China negotiates with other adversaries in Asia, say Japan, Vietnam? Are there significant differences, or broadly the structure is the same? This
Some
is
of
from
the,
Mr. Ashok Chaugule.
some of the structure is the same, but there are significant differences in any negotiation that takes place. And therefore, I think one of the points that we need to understand as Indians is that there is a different strategy and a tactic you follow when negotiating with the Americans, for instance, or with the Japanese, than you would follow when negotiating with the Chinese. And therefore, simply domain knowledge, that is subject knowledge, if you're negotiating a trade agreement, for instance, subject or domain knowledge alone is not sufficient. You need knowledge of the negotiator, of that country's negotiating history, capacity, capabilities, and so on. And it is only when you put the two together that you have a successful negotiation. To that extent, therefore, I can say that negotiating, the Chinese style of negotiating with Japan and Vietnam or Southeast Asia, for instance, is different from India, because there are certain different historical circumstances. There are different levers they can use or buttons they can push. With Japan, they have been doing it for the last 70 years over over the Japanese invasion of China and the war crimes during the anti-Japanese war. With Southeast Asia also, they have been doing this by alleging, for instance, that many of them have sided with the United States or are, hosting bases that the Americans have, and that these are all part of an anti-China containment strategy. And so therefore, I think, let me put it this way. These are very sophisticated diplomats. The Chinese are extremely sophisticated diplomats. They know how to use the whole toolbox of diplomacy. They do their homework. One of the points I made in the book. They read up on the country's history, on the subject matter, on the negotiator when they come to the negotiating table. And therefore, I think a lot of the homework that they do pays off. Lately, of course, there have been some mishaps, substantial ones. And I think, again, part of it is perhaps because a certain amount of professionalism that might have been there earlier, that is Chinese diplomats coming and going from the same region or studying the same country, is giving way to careerism in a sense, climbing up the diplomatic ladder without really getting any diplomatic expertise. But that's a subject to be studied. That's just an anecdotal sort of comment I'm making. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the case.
So here's a question, or actually from a couple of colleagues, people who are watching here, is that it's a little bit speculative, but I think it follows from your emphasis that we need partners and we need in this situation that we are going to. So the question is, can India truly rely on anyone, the USA, for example, in a real crisis?
Well, Akbar, I think it's an axiomatic to say that, frankly, if you want to be a major power, you can only rely upon yourself. And through history, any empire or major country has ultimately developed its own economy, its own scientific and innovative capabilities, and then subsequently its own military capacities. I believe that is the course we are following. Whether we achieve success or not depends on us as a society. But at the end of it all, I don't think it is a black and white choice between aligning with somebody to the extent of entering into an unbreakable alliance or not doing anything with that country at all. I think the gray zone is where we operate in diplomacy. Diplomacy is all about the gray zone. And I think we need to explore the boundaries of that gray zone, not just with the United States, but I have been maintaining for some time in all my webinars with Russia as well. That's a strategic ally we have. Maybe we have some differences of view on some issues, but let's not forget that they have come to our help strategically when we require it, with Germany, France, with the United Kingdom, with a number of other countries. And if we are able to resolve problems with China, with China as well. So I don't think it's an either or choice. I think we should look at the gray zone in between.
So I think we are running out of time. One last question to you, and that's a more one, again, very speculative, but looking at the other side where you ended. And that is the question is that both China and India are key players in the global south. They have initiatives of cooperation in various areas, including in BRICS. So when you say that peaceful coexistence is over, will there be any areas of coexistence or cooperation that you see that can lead to a better atmosphere that can work further down the line? So are they basically green shoots in this the rather barren pasture?
There might well be, Akbar, but I think we also go out, along with peaceful coexistence, what has gone out of the window is any belief among Indian policymakers that when China says there is enough space for India and China to grow together, that they actually mean it. I don't think that by their actions and gestures they have shown in any manner. And we can go all the way from the issue of Masood Azhar and the UN Security Council seat all the way to RCEP at the other end, where they have shown that India's core or critical interests could be accommodated, or at least some compromise could be reached in order to bring India into the arrangements. In fact, in many cases, the Chinese have either overtly or covertly led efforts to keep India out of those arrangements. Therefore, I think on the broad plane, this appears to me in the short term to be more of a pie in the sky. However, there are, of course, obviously issues where we share at least some concerns. I don't think they're identical. Even on climate change, they're not identical. But there are on climate change, on anti-piracy, on marine pollution, on a number of issues, even in the WTO for that matter, where there is common ground. A lot of effort will have to be made by the Chinese side to convince us that they believe that our interests become part of that effort that they will put in, rather than simply using our shoulder to shoot off. And I think that policymakers, diplomats, business persons will approach China with a great deal of skepticism. Now, as compared to the pre-2020 era, when there was a substantial part of public opinion in India which believed that irrespective of whatever problems we might have, there are common issues on which we can work together. That's my take, at least.
Well, thank you very much, Vijay. We've overshot the time, and I can see there are another 25 questions awaiting your response. I suppose we will have to work out some other format where you quench the thirst of all those who want to know more about your views on China, about China and India, and about the impact that China is likely to have on all of us in whatever profession we are. So all it remains now is I'd like to thank you for this enlightening hour that you spent explaining to ordinary people what China is all about, the difficult situations that we face, the opportunities that we may have. And I'd like to thank Ananta for providing this platform to sensitize a broader audience of some of the nuances of our engagement with China, which is, as you started by saying, amongst the major challenges that we as Indians will face in our lifetimes and of the next generation, given the situation that we are in. So once again, thank you very much. And you'll have the last word, so to say.
Thank you. Well, Akbar, thank you very much for doing this, sharing this session. And I also thank Ananta very much for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all the questions. I hope that whatever I said made some sense. And I look forward to coming back on Ananta again. So thank you, Akbar. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Vijay.
Thank you. Bye.